our house, 5368 Lime Avenue. And I actually picked that house, or I mean, I'm sure I didn't, but I thought I did as a child. So it was shortly after my 5th birthday, and I remember my 5th birthday ending at the garage house. So like we had this big old blowout 5th birthday party for me in the back of our uncle's house. And then like a month or 2 after that, I remember Mom would take me with her to see houses all over Long Beach. And I remember some of the other houses that we looked at. But I remember most when we pulled up to Lime Street, we were actually riding in the real estate agent's van. And I was sitting in the back with their fluffy white dog. And I wasn't in a seat for some reason. Like, I just remember being on the floor of the van holding the dog, not buckled in or sitting anywhere. And then I remember them pulling up in front of the house and opening that slidey van door and seeing the house and being like, oh yeah, this is my home. And then the next thing I remember is being sent to play out back with the dog in the backyard while Mom and the real estate agent, I guess, talked numbers and looked at papers and stuff. But I remember going into the backyard for the first time, and the mandarino was there, and it was huge. I don't know if you ever got to see it when it was the biggest, but it was like the width of the house itself when we first bought it. And it was full of mandarinas when we showed up that first time. And it was so heavy with fruit that the branches were like scraping the ground. So it was like this tent of tree. And I immediately went to go hide in it and like play in it. And I remember that somebody had put like a slightly raised wooden platform all around the tree, like they'd made a stage or something. And I don't know why that was there, but I immediately started like tap dancing and stomping on the wooden platform. And I remember the real estate person and his partner and Mom came out and were like, oh, look at that, she loves that house already, this is where you're going to have parties and this is where you can have dances. That first time there wasn't, I don't have any other really strong memories of the house or that place. I think that day was the day that Mom decided on that house. So I think after visiting the house that day, she started the whole process to officially buy it. You remember a lot of the house itself, of the Lime Street house. For one, I remember its greenness. I'm pretty sure it's not green anymore, but in my mind and memory, it's always green. When we first bought it, it was like a fading pine tree kind of green. And it was a really old school 20s house that had these like wooden shuttered windows, and they were all painted on a more intense green, and Mom kept those. And then throughout the years, we painted the house like 5 different shades of green. But it was always green. The house started out with only 2 real bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and the living room, and that was it. And the living room used to have a chimney. And then I think by the time you were born, we probably started getting rid of like the bones of the house. So we got rid of the chimney, and Mom had started knocking out walls. I don't think there were any new rooms built, but she started expanding into the backyard. So she created like an outdoor room, a back patio plus an outdoor covered area, and extended into the backyard. And that then became your room years later. outdoor extension. Mom really lost her family right before you were born, and I'm not sure why that happened, but Mom's family was always around. Our house was always, always, always full of 1.5 million people, and like I never even knew if they were all related to us. They weren't, but Mom was always hosting someone. Our house was always small, but there was always room for people, and it was mostly migrant working men. So Mom's house was like a stop along some invisible route for migrant workers who had just crossed the border and were trying to get to Central California to work in agriculture. And then besides that, the house was also always full with Hedda's friends. This was a really social period for our family. And like every fucking weekend, there was a rager at our house. And by rager, I mean like multiple Costco carts of beer and multi-day barbecues and people drinking until 6 a.m., even though they had to go to work that day. Our parents partied hard. I mean, not Mom, but, our extended family partied hard. And it happened at our house a lot. And I'm not sure what happened shortly before you were born and shortly after we actually got the house, but we started seeing less of all of those people. For the better, certainly in some cases, but also for the worst in others. It became lonely. And by the time you came around, what I felt the most was that Mom was alone. Her sisters wouldn't talk to her anymore. Her brothers wouldn't talk to her anymore. And we had an uncle, Tío Jorge, and I don't know if you remember him, but he was like Mom's best friend here, and he was a huge support to her. And when the house just kind of got abandoned and Mom didn't have her family anymore, I really missed his presence, and I knew that she'd lost some major form of support. So all of that was happening as Mom was focusing more and more on building. I think you're probably the most important happening in the time history of that household. And I think in Mom and I's personal histories, it was really big for both of us when you were born. And when you were born, it was the first time that Mom made an honest effort to have a better life. And so we were all really excited. Mom, for the first time that I knew of at least, was really upfront about boundaries. And she put expectations on Hedda finally. And there were like deals made and promises made. And I think it gave her more energy to put into the house because she saw a future. She thought things were really going to get better. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she knew they weren't, and so all of her energy went into this never-ending project. But for me as a kid, I felt very excited. I felt like we were a new family and we could have a different dynamic. And that meant even having a new house. And that was pretty cool. The remodeling started pretty immediately. And it's like the house has always been under construction. It's like the house is a never-ending project. But it started with plants. So first, we redid all of the trees and flowers around the house, and Mom had really beautiful gardens. Right before you were born and up until you were very little, Mom was still very close with her family, and they would come visit us every end of season, and so they all worked in farming in Central California, and they would bring us cuttings of all the things they were working with that year. So every season, Mom got a new truckload of roses, of all these like exotic, amazing roses that our family was growing for farms up north. So the house was like surrounded by a wall of roses, and the backyard had like every kind of fruit tree you can imagine. And because we got new ones every season, we would just sometimes let one, like if it didn't succeed, we would rip it out and replace it with another one. But there was a changing cast of fruit trees in the backyard, and it was more like an orchard than a backyard. And there was a storm when you were probably like 2 or 3 years old that made a tree fall into the house. So there used to be a really, really big tree out front of the house on the sidewalk. And lightning struck it and split it in half, and one half of this big, heavy tree came right through our roof and my bedroom window. And Mom and I patched that up, which was pretty cool. She taught me how to do a lot of cool stuff. I think I was like 10 when I remember working on the house the most, and it was mostly me and Mom who did the renovations. So she would draw the plans herself, which is pretty badass. And she would come up with what she wanted, and then she would come up with the budget, and she would do all the shopping for the materials herself. And she even got like a contractor card, which she's definitely not allowed to have. But if you have a contractor card, you can shop at special material stores and get better prices. So her and I removed the chimney, opened holes in basically all of the major walls of the house and stuffed them with insulation. And we also insulated, first we created an attic. There used to be a hole up to the roof, but there wasn't like anywhere to put baseboards or anything. It was just a hole in the roof. And so we made an attic and then insulated it. But actually there was also a period of construction, I guess, between us working on the original house and the 2 bedrooms and Mom really expanding the house and creating a new house, basically. She worked in the garage for a while, and there was a lot of remodeling happening there. She added, the garage, by the way, used to look like a fucking barn. It was like a clapboard, 2 pieces of wood chained together to make a door barn thing. And like, I think a car maybe could have fit there, but probably not. So Mom put like a proper garage door on it, also insulated it. For the longest time, she was trying to convert it into another little side house. And we used to have out in the huge backyard like these different sheds. There was like a kind of greenhouse gardening shed, and then I had a pet chicken. So we had a giant wire coop for her, which when the chicken was murdered by the neighbor cats, the chicken's coop became my playroom. And you probably don't remember this, but Mom and I like went into the chicken coop and put up real wood boards and like made it into a room, and we put a real roof on it, and you and I would play in there, and that's where our toys always were. And so that little chicken coop room is now that room that Mom did finish, and it's attached to the garage. that used to be a chicken coop. And I think it was probably around that age, if not younger. Mom once told me that I needed to help her because everything she was working for, all these construction projects in the house, were for us. And when she died, this was for us. And I told her, well, I don't want the house. I want a good life with my parents. I won't take your house if that's what you're saying. I will never take this house. And she was really angry about that, I remember. And that's when I stopped helping her with construction. And then I left the house pretty soon after that. The last thing I really remember being work done was the insulation of the attic. And then when I came back, Mom had made her room bigger. And then the next thing was we had a dining room. So the kitchen was extended and a dining room was made. And then next was that closet, like the closet/laundry room. And then next was your room and the bathroom. In my mind's memory, I guess, the house doesn't at all look like what it looks like now. I know it's a stucco house, and I know it's a bigger house, and I know it has like columns and things, but when I think of the house that I lived in, it's a small house, it's a wooden house, it's a very open house, and it's very green. And that's certainly the way that by the time I left, I thought of that house. That's just what it is in my mind. And for me, as my own person outside of this household and this family history, I was grappling with some really intense emotions. I'd always been an intense kid, probably, and I had definitely been raised to be a mini adult kid. And so by the time I was like 9, I felt like a fully fledged adult, especially amongst all of these crazy wayward adults who were super responsible, and home life was super unstable. So by the time I was 9 and 10, I was becoming very independent. And home really stopped being home for me, because that was our parents' house, but there was nothing there for me. I didn't have my own room. I didn't have my own space. I was definitely never safe there in that house. I never knew who was waiting for me, or in what mood, or under which influences. And I think that's around the time I started to want a different home. So what I learned about home and about myself at that stage was that family was important, but only because they were supposed to be the people who helped you, the people who loved you, and the people who made you feel safe. So if your blood family wasn't any of that, then it was okay. You just had to find it somewhere else. And that's what I started to do. So instead of my home being in our family's house, I found my home in the streets. And it was awesome. I was a really wild kid, and I wasn't afraid of much. So when I figured out that all of the things that made our family home unsafe for me meant that I could probably get away with a lot, I started making friends and family outside of the home. And it started first in our neighborhood, which, when I think of home, I feel a lot more like our street, our neighborhood is my home, as opposed to the house, mom's house. I really don't feel any tie to that place as my home anymore. But when I go back to Lime Street, I do feel like I'm going home, but it's everyone. It's all of the houses, and it's all of the stories that I know, and it's all of the people that I grew up with there. So what was happening in our house was not rare at that time, and it was definitely common in our area. We lived in the hood, and hood life is hard for everyone. And that meant that, yeah, our family was fucked up, but so when it was everyone else's. And that was a big comfort to me, to be able to bond with other people. We never talked about any of this, but we all understood why we didn't want to go home, and why we all would rather get in trouble for being out late and playing in the street than just like go home to have dinner. So I don't know if you remember this, but I actually moved out when I was in middle school. I was probably 12, and there was something that happened that showed me that things were just not going to change at home, and that they might get worse. And also around that time, Hedda started being in the house more, and I just could not take it. He and I would fight constantly. And for the first time ever, Mom was always taking his side, and so I just could not live there anymore. So one day, I just did not come back from school. And by that point, by 12, I was already not coming home sometimes, and I would be gone 2-3 days, and then I would just show up again. But this time, I didn't come back at all. And Mom finally freaked out after, I think, like 3 days. And she knew my friends pretty well because we were all so close. So she went to my friend Chris and asked him where I was. And he genuinely didn't know. None of my friends knew where I was hiding. But she finally figured out what I was, like, she finally figured out that I was trying to live somewhere else. And she was surprisingly okay with it. And I don't know if that's because she thought maybe I would, like, have it hard and learn my lesson and come back. But she was wrong. I only discovered that it was easier and better for me not there in that house. So one of my first homes of my own was the train. I would walk from school to the train station with all of my friends, which was really nice. And then I would get on the train and everyone would go home, and I would pretend that I was catching the train home too. And instead I would just ride the train all night. And at that time, they would kick you off the train at like 3 a.m. And then it wouldn't start again until 5. So I would just hang out somewhere between 3 and 5. Always in Hollywood. And it turns out there were a lot of other kids doing similar things. So there were like little safe places where you got off the train, and like right above the train station there was like a little coffee house that was open, and there were just a bunch of little ratty kids. And so that was also one of my first homes, was hanging out with other kids who were up to no good, and us all together was safety. So just having them around was like a home. When me not coming back to the house became more permanent, and started looking harder for me, I had to figure out a more permanent solution. So I lived with friends. I bounced around all of Long Beach, and it was really fun. I got to live in parts of Long Beach that otherwise I would have never got to experience. So I lived in Bixby Knolls, and I also lived in Compton, and I also lived right off of Pine Street, and I also lived in Naples, and I also lived just across the street from our house on the other side of Atlantic on Linden. And I did that until we couldn't do that anymore. And then I came back for a little bit, but it was never the same. And it only got harder and harder for me to put up with being in this house, knowing that I could go somewhere else. When I was 15, I moved out again, more permanently. And at that time, I had an older boyfriend who lived in LA. And I went to go live with his sister, actually, who lived in an area of LA that I would end up making my home years later on my own. But right before I did something pretty stupid and decided to move with him to another city, Jen found out, and she was like, "You can't do that." And I trusted that she understood my situation. She knew I couldn't go back to this house. I also couldn't keep being a homeless kid. And one of my only options was leaving town entirely with this sketchy dude. And she came and found me the night before we were supposed to leave, while we were packing. And she convinced me not to go. And she said she told her parents, and that they were horrified. Nobody had any idea that I had been homeless for this long at this point. Nobody knew. And her parents asked if I would please go live with them instead of doing this stupid thing. And I did. So then I lived with Jen, and I would switch between her parents' house and our parents' house if mom needed help with you. But during that period, from middle school to the end of high school, when I was jumping around a lot of places, what was really home for me was Long Beach itself. I spent a lot of time at the beach, at Long Beach Beach, but also at Seal Beach, because those are other great places for homeless kids to sleep. And so my Long Beach, which was my only real home then, was this like beachy, chill, reggae-infused city. And I feel like someone was always barbecuing. No matter where I ended up or where I was staying, someone was always barbecuing. Someone was always drinking beer. And the train was also home a lot, and I, to this day, have a very sentimental love of the Blue Line. And that kind of looked like really empty train stations, because the Blue Line and trains in general in LA were not very used at the time. So it was usually just me and like older dudes just shuffling around. But when I think of all of my homes in that time period, it's a happy image. I imagine them all being in summer, which is my favorite time, and which makes everything look and feel very warm. And when I think of Jen's parents' house, well, their house looks pretty much exactly the same as when I first started going there. And it's a very small, modest, also old school style wooden house. But more than the house, I remember the yard, because that's where we always played out front, and the street, because it's also where we always played, and the corner store that was on our street, on Lime Street, because that's where you would go to get anything and everything. So I remember that Tom's Easy Mart a lot. And that was Jen's parents' house, was my most stable home environment, probably my entire youth, but definitely what got me through high school. I always knew I could go back there, no matter how bad it got somewhere else.